I know Representative Bakeberg was going to be flying, so he was going to jump in um, as he can. Well, let's get started. We'll call the meeting of the what do we call? We're calling the Student Attendance and Truancy Legislative Study Group to order. Nick, do you want to do a roll call for quorum purposes?
Sure. I'm not sure if my mic is working.
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Uh, Chair Keeler,
Present.
uh, Vice Chair Kunesh, uh, Representative Lawrence,
Present.
Senator Farnsworth,
Present.
Representative Vernick.
Here.
Chair, that is a quorum.
Thank you. Can we get a approval for the minutes of, what were the date? October. What was our last meeting date?
October 7th.
October 7th.
To approve the minutes for October 7th.
Ernig moves to approve. Can I get a second?
Lawrence will second.
Lawrence will second, and it looks like Bakeberg's on too, just for attendance purposes. Great. So moving in to what we're doing today, I've kind of chatted with, I guess, some of you. This is going to be a fairly light meeting in the sense that it's just us for the first half, really talking through what we've been talking through is we have a preliminary report that's due with recommendations to the legislature. I think sort of after every meeting or every conversation, there's no stakeholders that are necessarily joining us today. The agencies will be available at the latter end of this meeting if we have questions that we want to ask publicly of them. My hope is that each of you have found something, or if there's something individually that you want to look into, you've known the individuals in the agencies that we can kind of chat about things as well. And so my hope is that this meeting is us just kind of hashing out some last minute things publicly that we want to talk about when it comes to aligning what our preliminary recommendations will be. Nick is working on putting all those recommendations together for us. And so I think we're not going to be real formal in this, and we're all virtual. It is being shared out, so it is public information, but we don't have any stakeholders here with us necessarily. And so are we good with just each kind of going around and giving like maybe your top couple priorities? I know we've done that a couple times, but now from a lens of our original intent here was to find some recommendations that we believe are bipartisan and bicameral and in support, that we could all walk out of here and say, yes, we agree. This recommendation is something we should all look at. They're not big, robust funding asks. They're not like big, massive policy changes. They're pretty kind of basic, simple things. And so with that, are we sort of okay with that style of each of us just going over some of the recommendations and some of the reflections we've had, allowing Nick to jump in to clarify anything that maybe he needs for a report, for the report that he's going to be working on this. It's a real basic level report first. And then that's what we'll share out. Stakeholders and the Minnesota public will be able to see it. They'll be able to come back and give us some feedback, sort of like a testimony style. We want to know where people land on some of these suggestions, improvements we can make, and then going into a final report in December for the legislature. So are we okay with that structure? We'll kind of just be loose with that. Okay, sounds good. So let's do it popcorn style. So once you're done with your statements and you're reflecting, do you just want to pick somebody else to pass it to, so that I'm not jumping in trying to do this thing, or we're trying to go back and forth? So I just think it's smoother that way sometimes. So I'll start by going over to Senator Kunesh. If you want to start us off with just some of your top takeaways and what you feel like maybe you would like to see in the recommendation piece.
Yes, and unfortunately, my sound was not working for that first part of what you were saying. So are we looking at what was sent to us or just off the top of our head?
I think it's just kind of a combination, a reflection of kind of all of it, and then where we
Okay.
want to like align and move forward.
Okay. I guess my initial thoughts on this is that number one, this isn't something that schools are just brushing under the rug and ignoring. This is not something new. And so there have been very intentional efforts for quite some time, probably even before the pandemic, to address the truancy issue. And number three, that yes, indeed, there are some districts that are jumping in, you know, head first in addressing this in a really methodical way in partnership with the counties. But if we're looking at, you know, possible recommendations or things that we can do, I think that it would be in the best interest of not only the education committee, but HHS, who works with the county, that we start working together in funding some of the initiatives, and districts are approaching this and addressing it in different ways, some really great ways, but funding, of course, is always a huge issue when it comes to anything. But if we don't sort of nip this in the bud really quick, we're going to lose too many kids in the long run. So that's sort of my thoughts in the last the last few weeks or months that we've been talking about this. But I, for one, find it encouraging in the different efforts that are being made across the state, including our tribal schools. Is that what you were looking for?
Yeah, I think that's good. Are there any, when you say like funding areas, I know that we've been given a couple different like areas that people say they would like more funding. Are there specific areas like, you know, we think about the, what were they, the community engagement centers or the family centers that some communities had, or like the robust systems that they were investing in technology wise? Like, do you have an idea of where funding wise you see a need specifically or as a
Yeah,
whole?
yes, thank you for that. I, I'm a fan of community schools and having those wraparound services right there where it meets the students and the families. I was just up in your beautiful school district last week and very impressed with the work that Moorhead is doing as far as making sure that, you know, there's like a health clinic on site for the high school. There are counselors and other support systems that are there. So looking at how we can bring those services into our schools. And I know that in greater Minnesota, especially, it's harder to find counselors, to find social workers, to find those kind of professional school nurses. But how can we perhaps allow some flexibility with some of the funding that we had put towards school counselors and social workers? How can we provide a little bit more flexibility so that the schools would be able to use those dollars? If they can't hire a nurse or a social worker or a counselor, would it be possible that they would find that they could use those dollars towards perhaps truancy efforts in a different way that would meet some of those social emotional issues?
I think that's an interesting concept because we've I think the one thing that we continue to learn and that we've learned about the counties is this idea that the communities know, one, what the communities need the most, but they
Uh-huh.
also know what resources are already in those communities. And so for
Right.
us to say, like, you know, you need more social workers when maybe there's like a massive like social work shortage in every capacity there, it's hard. And so
Yep.
I like what you're saying about a little bit of the flexibility in spending, like maybe rather than saying like you have to do these rigid outlines, it's more the out goal, like what's the intended goal with the money and how are you utilizing your local networks and your base
Yeah.
that you already have available
Yeah.
to build it. I like that idea. Does anybody have any feedback on that idea?
Totally agree with that. You know, providing districts the funding, and then, you know, flexibility on how it's used is is critical because to be honest, there is a shortage of of social workers and school counselors. So when we provide these rigid structures, oftentimes, people making hiring decisions, they don't have someone who's licensed, but just an amazing fit within the community, and you can't hire that person.
Yeah.
And then maybe what happens is you end up hiring that person as a para and they're doing a lot of the work, but they're just not getting paid what they could because they don't have a license. So I think I would 100% agree with Senator Kunish about, how do we providing flexibility there? But even just from licensure in general, how do we provide some flexibility to be able to, address the needs? Because that's really at the end of the day, oftentimes it's just having a body to do the job.
I think that's where too, for me, I like the conversation that we were leaning into of having like attendance liaisons.
Yeah.
And I know we've talked about that, right? So if it's not a licensed social worker, and you've all heard my story enough to know, like, I think liaisons will save the world, and from a fiscally sound space, right? And so I do think that those sort of roles could be really robust in this, knowing that maybe it's like it's just a different lane of support.
Yeah.
And also, I think leaning into the liaison conversation, which is one of the things that I think we've all acknowledged sounds like a very financially reasonably like appropriate space, but also we have people in our communities that could become liaisons fairly quickly. The background, the education background that you need to have isn't like teaching licensing, isn't like social work licensing, isn't like media specialist licensing. Like it's just a very different lane. And so do we want to lean into, well, I guess Senator Kunish, I don't want to send us off on a tangent on other things. Were there other things you wanted to add? Because I do want to make space for this liaison conversation a little bit.
Yeah. And I can tell you from my 25 years of teaching, I can think of half a dozen individuals who were paras or educational assistants who were actively in that role of building relationships with the kids and with the family and with the community, specifically around absenteeism and truancy. And those were the folks, and I'm going to tell you, they were guys. So those were the guys that were going out into the community, to the homes. They were trusted. They had some resources that they could make available to the families. They could help problem solve. They did, in certain instances, get some unique professional development around how to best work with families and students who are, in a sticky situation for whatever reason. So I don't think it's just like hire somebody and send them at it, but there has to be some training and some expectation out of it. But I'm very much interested in learning more about and thinking about how we can possibly work outside our usual bubble of personnel when it comes to schools.
I agree. I think the recommendation out of that, and like the thing too that like I have to tell myself, because I'm a big thinker and I'm a big doer, right? That study groups are really designed to like just pare us back a little bit and give us like this direction. And so I think that, you know, the recommendation out of this is for us to explore partnering with the counties, partnering, you know, a lot of it was liability stuff too, that we
Yep.
talked about, like, you know, liaisons used to be able to give kids rides in their personal cars back to school. That was huge. We could get kids to school. Liability wise, we can't really do that. And so maybe like this recommendation, you know, the end goal is that we fund these positions and we open up these opportunities, but maybe like the first recommendation is really seeing like how counties are already utilizing them. What is the lane that they would land in? What is the, you know what I mean? Like figure
Yep.
out how we add liaisons into the structure of flexibility for local units to be able to utilize if needed.
Yep.
I love it. And I also think that every community has just unique populations. And so having liaisons that reflect whatever those unique populations are, whether it's young parents, doesn't have to be like, I want to make sure it's not always just like this culture or race based, but just situational. Military, that was one of the things that I think we didn't talk a lot about here, but we heard a lot in the Ed Policy Committee was you know, these families that come in and out because of military moving and just how you connect them to make sure they're successful in spaces as well. So I like that. Nick, do you have any questions for us from a clarifying perspective on putting this in the recommendations piece? We can chat a little bit in depth afterwards, but here, do you have any questions?
I don't right now. I've been taking notes. I think just later on in the meeting, I think it would behoove
Jump in.
the group if you sort of have a like clear ideas and you sort of vote to approve them. So there is like some consensus on what recommendations you want to more formally make.
I think that sounds great. Okay, Senator Kunish, do you have anything else in your recommendations or are you ready to
No,
pass?
I will pass it over to Rep. Vernig.
Hi, thank you. So, I am a big fan of full service community schools, school-based health centers, school-based mental health centers. I think the student support personnel aid, I agree, needs to be re-looked at. I heard from several schools that they didn't tap into it because it wasn't really even enough to hire somebody. So, you know, 50% of the schools don't have a school nurse. And the school nurse pay is so much lower than hospital or clinic pay. I mean, we heard it from the students around chronic disease management, access to mental health services. So of course, I mean, that's kind of where like I gravitate towards. I also agree with you on the supporting counties that be at home or be at school program, excuse me, not at home, be at school. And then Scott County, you know, Rep. Bakeberg, we heard from them and you've talked so highly about the work that they're doing. So if there's a way that we can, I mean, it all comes down to funding, right? Like, can we fund some of this work that's already being done? And at Rep. Keeler, you've, I think, articulated a bazillion times, like the community knows the community, right? So your county's going to know your community better, your school's going to know it better. I think one of the things that hasn't come up yet is the different models for school getting credit for your time. So things that, I mean, we heard that from students around allowing the local LEA to determine the instructional hours and having more flexibility around that with MDE. They seem rather rigid. So those things, and then I think one of the other things is around that 15-day drop. And, you know, could we look at that a little differently? So those were kind of the things that stood out the most for me.
Ask you, when you say the 15-day drop, are you thinking more, because I feel like the 15-day drop is two separate conversations sometimes, as like the first 15 days of school, they just haven't shown up, but we don't know where they're going. And so we just like drop them off the list. Or are you thinking more of those kids in the middle of, you know, the school year that are going through some kind of chronic crisis issue that then we just lose them for 15 days? Is there like a difference in what you see when you think 15 days?
I think it's probably both of those things. And Ashley, who came and spoke, you know, might be somebody worth having a conversation with again. But even more interventions along the way. supporting schools and counties to be able to do those interventions, which I think is sort of what we're seeing with the Be at School and Scott County. But yeah, I think it's something that probably needs to dig in a little bit more on. And maybe Rep. Bakeberg knows more about that, but that 15-day drop kind of came up multiple times. So
One thing, can I ask you your thoughts on, so when we talked about nurses and like access to the nurses in the healthcare system, I don't remember which school. One of the things they were doing is they were setting up like that early nursing system that like you could call in at 6:30 and kind of actually talk through it with somebody. Like, is my kid too sick to come to school, or is it cool if I send him? Am I gonna get a call at 10 a.m. that says I have to come back and get them? But then also doing that with some language interpretation. Like, I know that that's not something that's really happening in places, but like, did you feel that within the healthcare network and like mental health healthcare support, school nurse support, there needs to also be that language support in that capacity?
do you mean language support as in like multilingual,
Yeah.
so translation services?
Yeah.
I don't know if that might be impactful. I mean, I think a lot of schools use translating services. I'm not 100% sure. What I would say that around school health, um, I, I I'm a fan of looking at things real differently. So even mobile medical units, mobile medical clinics, as a way to provide your school health support. So maybe you don't have an LSN, but you have a health aide or an LPN. But if you had access to a mobile medical clinic that came out once a week, that could be pretty impactful as well. Even the chronic disease management. So I sat in with a lot of school nurses, right? And there was a Transition Plus program where the student was having trouble managing their diabetes, and the school nurse actually went to the appointment with, the student, the family, and the provider. And collectively, they were able to work together to come up with a really good management plan that allowed that student to stay in school longer and manage their chronic diabetes. But not every school has a licensed school nurse that can do that or has the time, right? So maybe the school district only has one licensed school nurse. Well, she can't be that liaison all the time. So I just somehow supporting full service community schools, school-based health centers, school-based mental health centers, and paying nurses at like more pay parity I think could be quite impactful for students. So that didn't answer your question about language. I don't know how much of a barrier that is.
Thank you. You have anything else, or do you want to pass it on?
Yeah, let's go to Representative Lawrence.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much. It's been a lot of fun going through the process here and hearing from not only our staff but our communities as we've kind of delved into this whole subject. A couple of things that are my biggest takeaways as we go forward to making some recommendations is one, I really got the feeling with the reports we got that we are actually climbing out of COVID. COVID was the worst time for absentee, for truancy. And we are working our way up and our numbers are getting better. And I want to keep that in mind that we are on a better path going forward already. With that being said, I think it needs to be echoed, and part of our findings or part of our response is that many school districts, and I'm not going to say all, but many or maybe most school districts report that they have a program, they have a policy, they are dealing with truancy absenteeism and have programs that many seem to be working and that they can build on. They shared with us some needs that they have. Several of those needs have been mentioned already, and so I don't need to go back into that. But they do have policies and programs that are already being utilized in dealing with their absenteeism and their truancy, and things that they've testified were working. And so with that, as we go forward, my concern is I don't want to see any policies proposed or made that would hinder some of the progress that's being made, but definitely comes alongside and assists. And where that is if they need personnel assistance. Like I said, several things have already been mentioned. Maybe it's personnel assistance. Maybe it's whatever, but some dollars for some programs that they're trying to fund and to expand them out. It mentioned that working with counties, sometimes that can be very difficult to work together with the county and both be on the same page. And so some of those things that we can come alongside and help with the programs that already exist. In addition to that, two things that I think really kind of were echoed to me as we talked about this was flexibility in curriculum. And what I mean by that is the number of activities that students take advantage of throughout the school year that they're technically counted absent for, but it really isn't a learning experience, right? It's something that they're learning from. And instead of those experiences being counted as true absences, figuring out a way, allowing the school district to find the flexibility so it's not counted as an absence, but it's counted as an educational experience, right? So opening the doors so school districts can do that. The other thing I kind of felt was very necessary is the flexibility in education in the regards that students being able to be flexible in the way they learned in the process. If the gal with diabetes was mentioned, right? If she cannot go to school because her body is not allowing her to function in that way, how does school come to her and still provide an educational experience that counts within the school district, that counts as her being present and going through the educational process? And so when I say educational flexibility, that's what I'm referring to. What are the possibilities that the student can't make it home because they're taking care of a grandparent, right? That all of a sudden they're at home taking care of a grandparent. They're not sick. They could go to school, but they could still do an online type learning or get right into the classroom. So those are the couple things that I came down to focusing on and would like to see in recommendations. I think they wind up being more policy things that we can encourage or set, less financial probably, but really things that hopefully empower our school districts to be more receptive to the needs of the students that they're serving. And I think based on testing, I think they're doing an awfully good job. Sometimes sounds like their hands are tied in certain areas. And so maybe opening up those possibilities.
I think that's really good. I think one of the areas that when we talked about like people's hands being tied, and one of the areas or the buckets that, were in my areas was the the data sharing piece with the county and the school. And remember, we talked so much about like if there was a hard road to get past, it's that communication on what you can share, the privacy piece of the data that you can share back and forth. And so it's one of the top barriers that have really come to like the forefront in these conversations. I feel like that's a piece that, again, like that's a recommendation that we deeply dive into, because I've said, even asking the question, what information are you trying to get? And you're not able to get it, right? Because like, I don't even think we know what hey, counties, what information do you want from schools? Hey, schools, what information do you want from counties? We're not even really asking that. And so I think like from this group, even asking those questions to start breaking down the barriers, because if we want the counties and the schools to work together really well locally, they have to be able to communicate together, I think, to build it out more robustly. And so I'm with you on that. And I like, go ahead.
Go ahead and interject on that same subject. From what I gathered is the school districts really are the ones that are on the prevention side, right? But the counties come down with the heavy hammer. And so it's not as much even like the counties needing the information, maybe providing the resources that are needed, but more so helping maybe with the preventive side of things. And that's kind of what I saw when I visited with Isanti a little bit, is they really kind of worked with their county on the preventive side, not the heavy hammer coming down. And so, and I don't know what kind of data needs to be shared on that level, because I think the schools are really the ones that have the data. If it gets to the county, it's not a data issue. It seems like it's much just more enforcement. It's like, this is your punishment at the county level because you've been truant so many days. And if I'm interpreting that wrong, I'm open to that, but that's kind of what I gather, is that once you get to the county involved, it's more the judicial system that's coming in and bringing down a level of punishment because you've been truant and absent from school.
I think the county kind of plays multiple roles, because then at some point they pass it over to their child welfare, and then it becomes like, you know what I mean? That's why the definitions were so important too, like what the school calls, neglect is very different than what the child welfare system calls neglect, and how we need to figure out some baseline terminology. I think I like we talked a lot about like the life learning experiences. I think that was brought to light with the ricing. I think we'll always go back and remember the moment that we learned about like the ricing piece of education, and how like making sure that maybe we're not saying that they're absent from school, but figuring out ways how that is actually counted towards educational credit in Minnesota. So I'm with you on that and exploring that a little bit more as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I could not agree with you more on that, in that the school district should be able to help develop like the pathways, and it isn't always linear Monday through Friday, right? Somebody shared about a welding program that was on Saturdays that they couldn't continue to host, but it was really popular. So I think the model that we have was designed, 100 years ago, and doesn't necessarily meet the needs of students today. And we're seeing that because students aren't coming, right? That's how they're voting. It's like, I'm not coming in because this doesn't meet the needs. So I couldn't agree with you more, Rep. Keeler and Rep. Lawrence.
Lawrence, you got anything else you want to add?
No, I'm good. I'll listen in. Thank you.
Okay, pass it over to somebody else.
How about Rep. Bakeberg? Go ahead.
Right. Good conversation. I'll go through because a lot of the things that I've been thinking a lot about has been talked about. So the school day, and then what constitutes a school day, the school calendar. Districts set their calendar, but like that Saturday morning welding class or whatever, doesn't count. So kind of thinking about that, and really making schools aware of the flexibility that they have, I think is important. And then the credit for different types of experiences. So I think that ties into the engagement for kids, and kids wanting to come to school. I think that's a really, really huge deal. And frankly, it also plays into an enrollment standpoint, because if kids are engaged and they're getting an education that's relevant to them, then they're going to want to be there. So the school day is a big thing I think we need to talk about. The definitions, we've talked extensively about that. Like that, I mean, that is such low hanging fruit in my mind. And if we don't accomplish that, then I think the rest of the work is kind of moot, because then that goes into the data, and I think that's one of the reasons we don't have the data that we're asking for, is because an excused absence in one school, and it could be within the same district, we heard, an excused absence in one middle school is an unexcused absence in another school. So we just need to make sure we clean all of that up and be clear. And then it's the local district's responsibility to implement that, once we have some consistent language and definitions. So that the definitions is a really big deal. And I think the one of the things, and Scott County highlighted this, is just the really breaking down the silos. And one of our first, early testifiers talked about that there's a lot of silos within these different systems, and to navigate those systems is really hard. So if we can break down some of those silos, so people are able to navigate and be efficient. So, I mean, because if we put more money into a program that isn't going to help this, that's a waste of dollars. So we want to fund things, but we want to also be efficient with what we're funding. So, because you don't want to fund something that isn't going to make an impact. And this is where I see that if we look at the MTSS model, and we heard extensively about that, and you flip that MTSS, like you have one triangle is the school, and then another triangle is county or tribal governments, and the more intense the need of a student within the school system, the more involved the county system is. So, and that's what has happened within Scott County, and Shakopee and Scott County talked about it. And it's not perfect. We're still working through things, but it's and then we have these partnership with outside groups as well. And it's helping kind of break down, but I think that the communication piece and that data sharing will help continue to break down those silos, and we can do that. So that's that piece. Addressing licensure and how, that's a big conversation. There's going to be a lot of thoughts about expanding licensure, all of that. But I think, we talked about that already. And then through it all, one thing that we haven't talked a lot about, and I just was thinking about this recently, is at the end of the day, we do all of that stuff. We're still going to have a group of students that are our most at-risk students. And that's really where the 15-day drop kids come in. And that's, I think, those are the students that we're really concerned about, because they disappear. And that's why I am concerned about those 15-day drop kids. And we often hear in the news that 10, 11, 12-year-olds are doing something, and then they get involved in the criminal justice system. So if there's a way that we need to have some communication, because the 15-day drop statute is a funding statute, so that a school can't get funding for a student that isn't at school. And that makes sense. But then, who finds that kid? And the really hard ones are the kids that move out of the community. So, those are the ones that are the most difficult. And one county talked about, they had, it was a few $1 million. I don't remember off the top of my head that I think, yeah, I'd have to go back in my notes and look, but there's about $3 million of students that they're losing at the 15-day drop. So how do we engage, and what do we do with those most at-risk kids? And that's where I think there is a place when school, county, and frankly, family members are asking for help from the criminal justice system. The sooner we intervene, then hopefully we alleviate and address a kid really heavily being involved in the system. So, yeah, I'll stop with that. That's kind of my thoughts.
I think that's great. I think the 15-day drop thing is interesting because I know that there's so much funding tied to it. I'll even, the lane that has always crossed my mind when we don't know who's picking them up on the other end comes down to like trafficking and murder and missing Indigenous relatives. And we have youth in this state that literally just go missing. And if schools aren't even like following up, right? Like, that's just the piece like that also is scary, is that how do we say, okay, after 15 days, right? Like maybe there is a funding structure, but you're right. Like who continues, like does this outreach to the family and the community and the youth in this space that like helps? Does that transition to the county? Does that transition to, I don't know, but I don't love that after 15 days, because you don't get the money anymore, you just don't really care about that student and their needs and where they're going. And even helping with the transition. I think that's the piece too, that like, as a liaison, we had a little bit more flexibility to start calling into school districts that we know kids are moving to, how do you register? Where do you go to register? Like helping them do that. Because often too, if a family is moving because of crisis, or we look at the homelessness population, the last thing they're worried about is enrolling their kids if they don't even know like where they're going to eat or where they're going to sleep. And so I'm with you on addressing that a little bit more, but it is that funding piece that gets really, really, really tricky, in my mind. Okay.
Can I just chime
go
in?
ahead.
I just have a question. Is there a way, like, if they looking at that 15-day drop, if the school gets reimbursed if they come back consistently, a way to help kind of bridge that funding gap and incentivize the school district to be part of recapturing that student? I don't know.
If the kid comes back, then they re-enroll. So
Yeah.
they're enrolled in the district at that time. I'd have to double check and see if we go back. I don't believe that a district, once you drop a kid, if the kid shows up 2 days later, I don't think you can go back and recoup those dollars. I think a lot of districts are, there's a lot of things in place before you get to a 15-day drop. I mean, there's multiple touch points that districts are doing it, and really it heads off a lot of those kids. Early in the year is really where you have it, because families move, and just like Rep. Keeler talked about, they're moving to a new community. They're not thinking about what to do and all that. And, oftentimes they just get settled, and then, oh my word, school started. I got to get my kids. So then they come, and then we will get, as a school, the records request for those kids. And we had a handful of kids this year that we were able to, that we 15-day dropped, but we were able to identify where they were at. So, and most of them that got to that point moved out of district, because schools get a records request. So then they're no longer on that list. But I found it in my notes. Hennepin County had 514 15-day drops. So, I mean, think about 514 kids were just dropped. So
We
someone
know that
has.
they mention how many of those were ever picked up somewhere else. Because I feel like that was kind of the next piece of that data point, right? Is that, like, of those kids, did we lose them completely in the education system, or were they picked up somewhere else? Right.
Yeah. And I don't know how those schools work it, but
Yeah.
like for us, we wouldn't have a kid that was picked up within that 514 kids. And, I can reach out to the person who gave us that data and ask her that. So.
Yeah, it'd be interesting, because I know, like, so I'm a border city, right? So, like, the Mars number thing works really great if you're moving within districts within Minnesota, because then you don't actually have to wait for the records request to come through on a fax machine sometimes, right? Like, I mean, and you're going through them, and it's crazy at the beginning of the year. I've done that role. But the other thing is that I want to explore, maybe from a more national level, is, for a border city like mine, what do we use if you're going to enroll in a Fargo school if they don't use, like, the Mars numbers, right? Like, is there a national student ID number that is implemented? Like, I that should be a really basic answer that I don't know, but does anybody here know if you get, like, a national student ID number? So if you cross borders to enroll in another district, it's talking to each other. I feel like it's no, but can anybody, like, tell me if it's different?
Rep. Keeler, this is Tim Strom from House Research.
Awesome. Are you
there
here
is
to answer all these questions for us?
no. there are a number of reasons why Minnesota chose not to use a social security number. A lot of controversy when the Mars system was created, and there's not portability of the Minnesota Mars number. That number gets assigned by the state of Minnesota, but a neighboring state won't pick that number up as its student ID number. And if a child first moved from Fargo to Moorhead, for example, they'd get a Mars number for their first time in Moorhead. But if they moved back to Fargo for a couple of years, then came back to Moorhead, their old Mars number should be reused by the district for them when they re-enroll again. But that number doesn't travel with them when they leave state.
I think that's silly. I'm just saying, from, like, if this is a national issue and, like, we have people that move in and out of different states often, I literally live 2 miles from another state. And so I think that's obviously a global issue. I thought the answer was no. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't missing that. There's, like, I know we can't use social security numbers, but that's a federal issue that I don't even want to touch. Senator Farnsworth, do you want to go? I think you're the last member to tell us your takeaways, inputs, and recommendations.
Sure, yeah, a lot of the stuff has been said. Um, I like the idea of flexibility both in curriculum and in the daily schedule, the yearly schedule. I mean, the schedule that we have with summers off is a result of farming communities needing to have the kids on the farm. And now, like in my area, the resorts would freak out if we tried to get rid of summer break and change the schedule because they need those workers. But there may be communities that don't have um, needs for summer workers like that, and so some flexibility might help. A couple people mentioned flexibility with curriculum, and I think Senator Kunesh is going to be surprised that I haven't brought this up more because it's one of my passions is the grad standards. I think our grad standards in Minnesota are ridiculous. Nobody really talked about it. So I do special ed testing for my regular job, and so I pull grades and I pull attendance. And it's interesting, I see kids that have maybe missed 20 English classes and they haven't missed one of their industrial arts classes. Which isn't to say that I think we should get rid of English. The only thing we should get rid of is Alge 2, um, but and that's sort of a joke, and we need to change that. But I think kids need to feel like they're getting something meaningful. And maybe instead of Alge 2, maybe a math for the trades if they're going to be a welder. And there's, of course, up here with all the mines, there's a lot of welders. And so I think that's one of the things we can do in regards to curriculum to make it more meaningful. And then the other thing, I heard a couple of people sort of touch on this, and then I hear it from the counselors that are just a couple of doors down from me right now. I hear it from counselors at other school districts up here. So we do everything we can to get kids in school. We call home, we have liaisons, we send a second bus or a van to pick kids up. We do everything we can. Well, what about that group of kids that just, and it's, for whatever reason, they just don't show up. So we turn them over to the county for truancy. I think at least one of the testifiers said it's kind of a waste of time to turn kids over for truancy. And that's what I hear all the time. It's like, well, what's the point? I think there needs to be some, I don't know if teeth is the right word, because I don't think kids should be punished for not going to school, because kids are going to be kids. Like if my dad didn't kick me in the butt and make me go to school, I'd have been happy to stay home and watch The Price is Right every day. But I think we need to have some incentives for parents like, hey, this is your job. You need to get your kids to school. We're going to do everything we possibly can to help you. But I don't really know what that would look like because I live in a different area than Senator Kunish or Representative Bakeberg. So my area has different needs. I mentioned earlier, like the wild rice thing, that never occurred to me. And I think, turning that into like an outdoor science credit or a partial outdoor science credit is a great idea. And so we need the flexibility, but we also need to sort of hold parents accountable. Like, this is your job. How can we help you get the kids to school? But if you're not going to choose to take our help, there's got to be some sort of a consequence. But I don't know what that looks like, and I don't want to be too punitive either. So that's what I got.
I like that idea of, like you said, like instead of being punitive, right? Because that's part of it. Like truancy came about because school is a requirement for you to send your youth to. It's not really an option. It's not like daycare. Like it's something that is by law in statute that you go and do. But like, because the truancy piece, the cycle of it every year, you really some places were saying they would maybe get 1 or 2 cases actually in front of a judge, and it's in like May, and then it starts all over again the next year. It is really like a lot of waste of time. So what are incentives, right? Like what an incentive program, like I feel like we have to think big picture outside of like what we've always done. And one of the things we talked about in the meeting with Representative Lawrence, because we both sit on early childhood, was like our childcare centers have a parent aware standard, right? And if you're good at it, then you're eligible for like state funding and resources because you've proven locally you're good at whatever this rating is. And not that I want to do like a parent aware, but if your local community is partnering with your local entities, whether it's tribal nations or whoever is in your region, and you're increasing your growth of attendance, right? Like, then is that the incentive that then you're eligible for funding? Like, I think like that's not it, but I'm trying to think differently of like, instead of saying you have to fit in this box, because I think we all agree that having flexibility, your community knows your community best. And we don't want to design a brand new attendance program in the state of Minnesota that's going to take it over. We want to lean into what the community they're already doing. But I'm with you that the wheels and the amount of money we spend every year to maybe only send 1 to 2 people to actually court is like a lot of money and time. And so, do you have any great ideas of what like incentivizing that would look like rather than like sending them through?
I think, and this is probably maybe a little simplification, like, so you have to take a 6-week class to get a driver's license, but anybody can make a human being and raise a human being. And I know when I brought my kids home, I had no idea what to do with them. And I have a master's degree in education, but I mean, maybe a start would be if you can't, if you can't get your kids to school, maybe we'll offer some, I don't know. I don't even know if I want to suggest a parenting class, because that sounds pretty miserable
Yeah.
for somebody to have to do. But like, if you don't have the skills to tell your kids, no, you can't stay home, you have to go to school today, maybe we need to teach those skills. And that's, we're seeing this in the Hibbing School District, and this is just a separate problem. Just the behavior issues have gotten so much worse. And the problem is these kids never hear the word no. And then they come to school and the teachers are like, well, no, you can't do that. And they flip out. At some point, we got to start teaching parents, tell your kids no, and tell them you have to go to school. And yes, there are some, mental health issues, and there's family issues, and there's all sorts of issues, but and that's probably just a small sliver of the population. But I think everybody that's involved in education probably sees that there's some kids that have, family trouble, and some kids that are involved with the law, and some kids that don't have transportation. And then there are some kids whose parents are just like, well, no, you don't have to go to school today. And I think we have to deal with all of them. And I don't want to generalize and say that all of the attendants are those parents who are like, well, no, you don't have to go to school. But I think we have to address that as part of this. But I don't, like I say, I don't exactly know how.
I just want to chime in there, Senator Farnsworth, your child behaviors. The Ashley who spoke, there's a PowerPoint that she has, and it talks about the barriers, and child behaviors was the #1 identified barrier. And then then she had a few others, like conflict with other students, housing, student mental health, student physical health, and transportation. But that child behaviors piece was, kind of the most outstanding issue that was identified.
I'm trying to think of the school year, the school day. The beginning of the school year is always really exciting for students, and it's exciting for parents, and it's exciting for teachers. And I think at every single grade level, the school will have a meet and greet with your teachers. Come to school one evening and meet your teacher, find your locker. Here's your schedule. Here's your Chromebook, those sort of things. Maybe we could incentivize schools to put together some kind of a like a little parent and student quick info session on those nights or those days that the student comes with their parents. And, so that the parents hear it, so the kids hear it, so that the parents can go back and say, look, you heard them that day saying this, that, and the other. Just like how school districts are really appreciating the fact that we said school districts have to come up with a phone policy in school. What if we asked the schools to come up with a truancy outreach program for parents and students? And if the students are already there, if the parents are already there, They do a 15 minutes, like this is why it's so important that you are here every single day as best you can.
I would add, I think, okay, so like family preservation is what comes to mind, right? So if you think about like truancy, if you're not in school, it rolls into like this bigger thing that then potentially your child gets taken away from you as a parent because or an adult because somebody in the system says if your child doesn't go to school, you're not a fit parent. And so one of the other things I think we've really moved away from that I know like when my older son was going to school better is there was just way more family and parent activities involved and intertwined with the school in general. Not like, hey, you are on the verge of missing too many school days, so you should come here, but more like bingo night and carnivals and like things that build this like family relationship with the school that I just don't see like as much anymore because we do it when we're at like at-risk youth. And I don't love using that word, right? But like we invite those families in for like unique things. But I think as a whole, the family preservation piece and like really talking about how education build your family network, right? Like your economics, your future growth, like that it's more of that intertwining. And if you go to school, because we also don't want to terrify kids. Like early on when we heard from students, they were like, well, the thing that got me to go is because my mom basically got scared, or they threatened that my mom was gonna get in trouble, and I didn't want like my mom to get in trouble. And I don't want to like scare kids into going to school. But I think that's where like going back to the community engagement, if they create more partnerships with the school district to intertwine with the communities, I think that that's like relationship building and family preservation, community engagement. But
So
better
if
than
I,
like a family, like better than like a family class if you're on the verge of like having some attendance issues. Go ahead, Senator Farnsworth.
well, I kind of want to add, I've been thinking about what Senator Kunish said about like making those presentations to parents, and I like that, but I think about like when on conference days, I'll walk around and talk to the teachers, how's it going? And like, well, that's the parents who don't need to show up are the ones who show up. And the ones who don't, the ones who really need to show up are the ones that don't show up. So I like the idea, but the question is, how do we get those parents to show up and see the value? And we know there's a lot of reasons, there's, trauma that's going on outside of the school, or they're maybe working or whatever. I don't know, but I like that. And I think Representative Vernick talked about the behavior. I like talking about that too, because if you have a parent that doesn't know how to deal with those behaviors, then sure, it's a lot easier to say, okay, you can stay home and watch TV rather than deal with the temper tantrum. So I kind of like those those ideas as far as reasons, but I don't really know how to address it other than to say we're going to teach you some skills. Here's some strategies to deal with these behaviors. But then, again, the parents that need to show up are the ones that aren't showing up. How do we get them to show up? So, and I don't have any ideas.
Yeah, and I can just attest as a parent of a child with ADHD and dyslexia who struggled in kindergarten and first grade. I mean, we were kind of at our wits' end on like, how do you manage, he's so different than my other two kids. And without, physical therapy and occupational therapy, I think we would be in a very different place now in third grade. And then, he's doing private tutoring to learn how to read and just learning how to, he did not feel connected. Now, I'm on the PTO of our elementary school. I have been for many years. We're a very engaged family. And for him to not love being there was really hard for us, right? And so sometimes those behaviors are things that you really need additional support. Now, because of my involvement with the school and having insurance and living in Egan, where there's an abundance of providers, we could get support that we needed. But in school, if he were to qualify for occupational therapy, it was like 10 minutes a week, well, he's getting an hour a week. And it has been really impactful for us to manage and for him to learn a lot of coping skills and recognize, even with his So he's a W sitter, right? And in class, they would have you come sit on the rug. Well, he couldn't sit on the rug. He'd just like lay down because as a W sitter, he didn't have the core strength to sit there long enough. Well, then it was like, well, you need to sit up. And he's like, but I'm exhausted, you know? So he learned how to sit crisscross applesauce and built up core muscle strength. If we didn't know those things, if we didn't have access to those resources, he would have just been chalked up as the naughty kid. And by the time he got to middle school, he would have been completely disinterested. So I think sometimes early intervention can make a big difference. And sometimes those behaviors can be, they're not intentional, right? Like, and parents maybe don't know, right? He was our third kid, so I knew something wasn't right. So I don't know. But I do agree with you, Senator Farnsworth. Some of it is just straight up parenting skills and abilities, or not, maybe not even being there because you're working multiple jobs and you're a single parent. But I can say just how impactful early intervention was for us with occupational therapy, physical therapy, and that crossover between our medical provider and the school district.
I think one of the things, and this is a good conversation, but what we're talking about is really one of the biggest frustrations in education. When I talk with educators, there's that parent engagement piece, and you know, one of the districts in my district, they're revamping how they do parent teacher conferences because you know it's contracted time. We do the conferences are done, but the parents that show up who really need to be having a problem solving conversation with aren't the ones showing up to conferences. So, shifting to more of an invite model or doing it throughout the school day so you can address the different shifts of work. And but then, yeah, I mean, how do you, and then when you do that, you have all those things set up and then people still don't show up. And that's really frustrating for educators who put a ton of time and energy into prepping for these things.
Yeah.
And then the people just don't show up. It's so there is a time and a place for accountability. I mean, there that has to be on the table to be able to say, no, your responsibility is to get your kid to school. And then as you move through high school, middle school and high school, it can look different. We could have a conversation. Someone brought up, Ben, could we ever tie a driver's license to attendance? And that gets into a whole other can of worms. But some of those pieces, and yeah. So there's just what we're talking about is probably the biggest root frustration of educators that I hear consistently, whether they're in the district that I work in or whether they're in, the district that I serve in legislatively, is that parent engagement and support.
If I can just add one thing, and I actually have to leave because I have to bring my kid to piano here in a minute. But something that Representative Bakeberg mentioned as far as parent engagement. So before this whole truancy subcommittee started, when I knew we were going to do this, I started scouring the internet for research. And there was one thing that all of the research pointed to, and it's parent engagement. Somehow getting parents involved in this process, whether it's what Senator Kunish was talking about, getting them in the building for a presentation or a liaison reaching out to parents. Then the number one thing that I found when I was looking at that research was that the only solution has to include parents. Otherwise, it's probably not going to be as successful. So, and so I'm going to leave with that and run and pick my son up and bring him to piano. And I apologize that I have to go early today, but my wife is working. So thank you.
Thank you. Watch your emails. We'll send you the draft to look over for a response. Thank you. Okay, I'll go over my buckets. Because I guess I'm actually the last member. I didn't really say my own, but so I've been like taking massive amount of notes and trying to figure out where do we go with the recommendations, right? Because we have like a laundry list of things we want to do. And I think like we have to again remember this is like we're trying to move a massive mountain that is an issue nationally. And it goes into a lot of different areas that we just have to really expand in the community. And so I've kind of come up with different buckets, and then I'm trying to put kind of what you've all said in these buckets of areas. And so if you want to roll with me as I like walk through this a little bit. And we do have the agencies here. I've asked them to come on just in case anybody has any clarifying questions. Not that we have to get deep into the weeds about anything, but I'm going to go over my areas. The number one area that I see, and kind of back to what Bakeberg said, that whatever we want to build, the foundation is actually definitions. At the end of the day, we're missing some really critical definitions in statute. It's something that the pilot program is working on right now. They're going to be giving us a report on what they use for their definitions within our state. I know that we have individuals working on from research what state definitions do we have versus federal definitions that we can't even touch. And so it's giving us the list to know like where we are both. And the definitions are two different areas. So one definition is like what the pilot program is doing and really making sure that like each school knows what is a half a day attendance, what is a tardy, what is this, and maybe leaning into asking MSBA to look at a model policy that they can just put out. That's not a requirement, those aren't mandates. I think they've come to the table as a stakeholder looking to add supports here. And so that would be a suggestion. The other side of that is this more like neglect definitions and what definitions translate from school entrance to then our CPS system with our kids. And that really is just a deep dive behind the scenes to look at and defining legislation and then putting it forward in statute to define, what is habitual truancy? What is neglect? And educational neglect. Like, let's really shore up some of those ideas. So that's bucket number one. Bucket number two, the recommendation I have is honestly, as DCYF develops as an agency, that they are required to partner with MDE, MDH too, because there's a lot of chronic health issues that are coming in. Department of Health wasn't really engaged with us here, but I do think that as we learned and kind of like Representative Vernick said with the chronic health issues and just mental health as a whole, that's a Department of Health area as well. And so just making sure that to break down the silos from a state agency component, that each agency has some sort of like direction that they're need to work with each other. The third area is this flexibility in what we are calling community engagement, cultural engagement. What does that look like? Right now there's the statute that says the 3 hours is where we stand, that you can be gone for 3 hours for a culturally excused area, but really looking into what is the definition of a field trip? What is the definition of the adult with somebody who's in a school? Like, could this liaison, we used to utilize community licensing, kind of looking at getting credit while you're out doing these community things. And kind of what Senator Farnsworth said, trust me when I tell you, I believe ricing probably involves deep levels of science, math, language, history. And so the kids are all learning those components by being out. So that's the third bucket. The fourth bucket is one that we didn't really talk about here today, but in general, I think we've kind of talked about. The original question I had asked in my bill that we pared this all down to was, I believe we all agree, we're not overly worried about the kid who missed 11, 12, 13, 18, 20 days. We're worried about the kids that are missing 50 to 60 days every single year. And the information that the state gives us annually doesn't really break down who those high risk numbers are. And so I think a recommendation would be that the department can do it. They have the information to break it down. This is also not like a mandate, but recommending to the state agency that they break us down, like how many people are 50% or more truant, or 60% and more, making sure that we really know that number. But then also one thing we talked about is putting in statute, and almost everybody's kind of doing this, but what is your elementary? And making sure that in statute, we know that when we say we want your data for your elementary students, that means K through 5. Middle school is 6 through 8. High school is 9 through 12, or whatever that is, because it doesn't matter what your building makeup is. That's how we're going to break down the data within the state. And that's an MDE thing. And then the last piece is that barrier and data privacy sharing back and forth from what the schools want, what the county wants, and how we share that information. But then also making sure that we get information out to families and guardians about their students and information that they have as well. I know that the other piece of it is this community support system. I think for our purposes, like it's hard to know, is it the school district's responsibility to teach parents how to parent, or is that a county's area? Like, whose responsibility is that? I know the one message we've all heard from school districts is like, do not add any more to our plate. Give us more supports than anything. And so I'm open for discussion, but I don't know if recommendations from this group on like the parenting piece, I think as a whole, engaging the family structure and the unit in which the adults are raising the kids is extremely, extremely important. But what recommendation would you guys, how would you put that into a recommendation coming out in this attendance group, I guess would be my question.
Well, it wasn't my idea, so it came up from somebody else, so I can't take credit for it, but I think it might fit in there is, when there was the teacher shortage, I guess they hired a professional PR company to kind of create a PR plan around that. Maybe it's using that a third party, like somebody who does it for a living, not MDE, to come up with the PR campaign around the requirements for this. I have heard from people that culturally going to school consistently they don't realize that that's a thing, right? So, we have to go all the time. I didn't realize that was a requirement, but maybe it's hiring a firm to develop a PR campaign. That way the schools don't have to do it individually, and that they can use that to say, hey, you have to get your kid to school. I wanted to say, to your point, Rep. Keeler, about MDH. MDH does have the adolescent school health team, the ASH team, who is really heavily involved in this kind of work. And yeah, we did not hear from them, but they do have a team there. So I wanted to give a plug for them.
Good. And more reasons, right? Like I do think that we have these like groups within areas. I just don't know. Our recommendation is that every agency works across agencies too, to make sure. I forgot my last recommendation, which I think is the most important one, is the liaison role. But it's kind of cool because I don't know if any of you sit on higher education and saw that the Department of Higher Education sent out a basic needs assessment recommendation. And what they're calling this role is a needs navigator. And what it is it's like meant to build relationships with students to understand what their entirety of the needs are and help them get connected in those resources, help them, whether it's like filling out their MA form or going to get a license so they have access to drive, or, getting into a doctor's appointment, or kind of whatever it is. That part of me is too, sometimes like if the higher education institutions are going to lean into this idea of need navigators, and like is that the next thing that we do as an education system of support, both K-12 and higher ed? Do we lean into need navigators in the community that then is designed to support kind of everybody who's having these academic educational areas? But I think the recommendation is that we open up local funding towards truancy to be more than just social workers and high licensed individuals, but allowing them to be, to explore liaisons or need navigators within their own communities, maybe as long as they're reporting back on what that looks like, because we put a lot of funding into the state sometimes for things, and we don't really get like the response on, is it working or not, or what would success look like, and is putting this money into this effort fiscally sound and actually effective, or do we need to reevaluate it? And so I think it's just exploring what a liaison position or needs navigator position could look like, and how we can maybe open up some already policy lanes to just add this as one of the potential positions that could be hired in some of those more rigid areas. Transportation was another thing that came up that I think addressing the 2-mile radius, and having different transportation options. We've done a lot of work with CDL licensing in the state to try to increase your ability to earn your CDL. But I think that's a whole other issue too. But from that component, we talked about individual driving and the liability issue of having, like an individual car, or do schools go to fleets more than buses? Because having a car of fleets, you don't need to do all the extra licensing to drive a massive vehicle if you could drive a van to go pick up people as well. So from what I've heard from all of you and the conversations we've had from stakeholders, and from the idea in which we're trying to set forward things that we all can champion together at the end of this, that's been kind of my end thought process of where we land with the 7 recommendations moving forward. I know that that's a lot, and I know it's hard to digest. And so what I want to suggest is, one, because we have agency people on board with us right now, in case any of us had any clarifying questions. So I want to move to that, because if we don't need the agencies here, we can dismiss them from the meeting, but want to do any members at this time have any clarifying or questions that they want to ask any agency or House or Senate research staff?
I do. And I don't know if it's for them or maybe you, Rep. Keeler, but do you know if the broader needs assessment that's done by counties includes questions around their student and or student attendance, absenteeism, or truancy at all?
Does any staff on here know that answer? Do you know, I mean, it might be something that the counties can answer for us. Like,
Yeah,
Angie?
oh, go ahead.
Oh, I interrupted you. What were you gonna say?
Yeah, I know that Hennepin County does a broader needs assessment, right? And it assesses everything from food to housing and medical. And I just don't know if it dives deep enough in to address what those concerns or the barriers to attending school are for their student.
I think it's I don't know the answer. I mean, I know when I did my practicum work in my community asking what the barriers to academic success were, I was like the only person asking that question in my community at that time. And so I guess I don't know. I don't know if anybody here has it, or if anybody's listening online from the counties, sending something back to Rep. Vernig may be good. You have a follow-up, Vernig? Okay. So back to, does anybody have any other questions for House Research or any of the agencies? Okay. Well, I want to say thanks to the agencies. I know that like adding these weird study groups in the middle of the interim to do these new wild ideas adds things to your plates. I know it's your, like many of you will say it's your job, but I do appreciate like the efforts that you have and the brain power you use to help us think big and kind of strategize and know where we're landing. So I think just kind of wrap up last minute things, Nick, I think you and I can work together based on some of the recommendations we've discussed here. What do you need from us next? Representative Lawrence, did you have something you want to add?
Yeah, and just more so a question, as we're making recommendations, and I wrote down your 3 buckets that went to 8.
7, I think. Isn't it 7? It should be.
I got 8 out of it, so.
Well, transportation, yeah, I guess. Okay, go.
But as we're making these recommendations, I'm just going to look at your definitions. I mean, how specific are we looking for recommendation? Are we just looking at recommendation that we need to define more clearly the terms used in our educational process? When we go to your number 2, do we define that these government entities need to work better together? Help me kind of see recommendation. How do we take this next step? What are we looking for this next step?
Yeah, they'll be pretty broad recommendations for us because this is the preliminary report. And so really what this is going to do is get us our buckets. And then Nick and I will work on the report. We'll send it out. It'll give like the minutes of the meetings that we've had, who's been there, all of that. And then we'll do these little buckets and then we'll send, Nick and I will get this out to each of you so that you can look at it. And then Nick, do you want to walk us through like the approval process of it? Because we have to have our preliminary report is due November 1st. And so based on kind of the buckets we had here, understanding what we've all said, we'll get that out in your mail. And then Nick, I'm going to hand it over to you because I feel like you maybe know the path better.
I don't know if I do, but my general thought is, based on the notes I've taken, and I'm happy to meet with you, Chair Keeler, or any of you in the coming weeks. I would sort of compile that recommendation spot on the draft that I emailed out, and then it would there would be multiple recommendations. And as a task, you would approve that. At a certain point, this body will need to actually take votes and make sure that there is consensus or at least majority approval on those.
So timeline wise, right? So we have to have our preliminary report done November 1st. Is that right?
Correct.
And we don't have another meeting before November 1st? Like, is this our last
That
meeting
is
before
also
November 1st?
Also correct. Yeah.
that is also true. I'm not sure. Someone else from House or Senate or LCC can correct me, but I don't think there's a strict statutory definition about what a preliminary report entails. So I think I'm happy to work with you, Chair Keeler, on the intervening weeks and sort of have something thrown together, and then we can make sure that that final report is actually voted on by the study group.
When is our next meeting?
That is an excellent question.
Like we're November 18th, right? Is the next one?
Correct.
We have our buckets now. We can go through those again. I mean, just so everybody knows what I think they're 7. Lawrence is challenging me that they're 8. I may have 9 or 10 after this, but the goal is that we don't want a bunch, but so a part of me wonders, should we run through at least what the bucket areas are that we're each talking about? And can we approve those with the understanding that Nick and I will work on the like putting it in the actual paper report and emailing it all to each of you and waiting, and then you guys will email back saying, yes, we've seen it. And then the thing is that then we come back and we do more work on it, and then we have a final approval in December. So I don't want us to get too caught in the weeds with the preliminary. If we're okay with the buckets that we've discussed, do we feel like we maybe are okay with that? I don't want to overthink this and I don't want to slow down the process because waiting until like November 18th just feels like a long time. Are we?
Does, if I might, does the preliminary report need to include our buckets at this point in time? Or is the preliminary report enough to say we've had this many meetings, we've invited this many guests? We've come to these 5 ideas maybe. Does the preliminary need to have a conclusion yet?
It doesn't
Or,
need to have
or
a
an update?
conclusion, but I think having the buckets is beneficial because then the next step is going to be like bringing stakeholders in to talk about the buckets that we're moving forward because I don't want to implement something that's impossible to implement on our county partners or tribal nations or school districts. And so I think that's why it's important for us to at least have the buckets of areas that we're working on in the preliminary so that we know when we have quote unquote testifiers come in or the stakeholders come in and engage, we know that we're staying within those parameters of conversation.
Okay.
Do you want me to go over the buckets shorthand one more time so that everybody knows what we're like voting on for the prelim that we'll come back and have? I promise we will have a robust conversation and these buckets may change. It's just to set up what our future conversations will look like. And Lawrence, you and I can also have like a deep conversation behind scenes too, if there's some additions, any of you, honestly. I mean, if we want to work collectively together on building more robust like recommendations, that's hopefully what we do between now and December, is kind of go back and do like our internal work together. So cool. We're going to run through our buckets. I should actually put numbers on these. So number 1 is, just the definitions. Talked about that. Number 2 would be the collectiveness, breaking down the silos, agencies working together. Number 3 would be the cultural or life experience part of lived experience curriculum in the community. Number 4 is the data spread of, go ahead.
Can I you said number 3, I had down more community engagement. You talked more lifelong, what'd you call it? Life experience? Do you remember what
Yeah,
it
well,
was?
I know that that's what like other people have been calling it, is
Yep.
like looking at flexibility and credit life experience. I think that is just a bucket itself, is like
Okay.
community engagement, life experience, the expansion of like earning credits versus saying that you're gone. Bucket number 4 is the MDE recommendation for the larger data spread, knowing like, our 50% or more. I know that that's something they can do. It'll be an easy spread for them. Number 5 is the data privacy sharing, just kind of asking what it is that we need. Number 6 is that liaison idea, needs navigators. How do we kind of expand into that? And then number 7 would be transportation. Looking into transportation. The problem with that is I think that's going to get into a lot of liability issues. And just kind of navigating how we actually physically get kids to school or home after school. So is that 7 buckets? What was your 8th bucket that I missed?
I had a number 6, a community support, outside support coming in. I think Representative Vierning kind of would discuss that, and I threw it down. So I think that got added in on your list.
We can add that, like the community involvement, like community schools involvement type stuff.
Well, I think she's talking about hiring outside personnel to come in and maybe provide services to a district, not necessarily being in-house, but outside of the house. So it probably isn't one that necessarily fits in the bucket list, but is a sublet of more of the buckets, maybe more of the community engagement. I don't know, it may be one on its own.
I think
Community
8
support.
is because I think too, that's where that parenting structure goes, right? Like all these kind of like the community has to take on some responsibility to help our education system be robust too. Like, right. It cannot be just a school system to provide all the needs that a child has. And so, okay, so those are the 8 buckets. Do we feel like everything that right? Like there's a bajillion things we can do, but I feel like these 8 buckets are things we can all at least align on some capacity of understanding coming out after this. And these are all things that stakeholders have brought to us that are already being addressed or needs that are being worked on in communities. It doesn't feel like we're necessarily adding anything new or taking anything away from what's already happening. How do we feel? Anybody? Okay, are we good with moving forward with just taking a vote on that, knowing that we're going to come back to this? We'll have more robust conversations, but this at least allows Nick and I to send out an information to say, you know, to the presentator or the presentations that come back. What bucket are you? What bucket? Well, what area do you fall under? Okay. So Nick, do you want to lead us in a vote? However, we need to do this.
Yeah, sure. Let me pull up something. So I think we should make it clear what members are voting on first. It probably should be in some form of motion.
Mr. Madam, go ahead. Representative Bakeberg, did you have the floor?
Oh, you can go ahead, Rep.
Okay.
Lawrence, too.
Well, I would just make a motion. I would move that as far as our preliminary proposal going forward, that we have 8 topics that we've discussed and are looking to develop more definitions, agencies, community engagement, the MDE recommendation, data, liaison role, and transportation. And I think I had community support, community engagement, community support, 2 different ones there. I would make that a motion to approve what's pretty much been talked about by Representative Keeler and proposed at this point in time. Is that in
Can we get
order?
a second? Yeah, that sounds great. Can we get a second for that?
I second.
I third. Great job, team. I know that we don't really need the third, but okay. Nick, does that help you from the official side?
Yes, something I
Now we
can
need
put
to
in the
vote.
minutes is great.
Okay, and then we vote.
Yes, Chair Keeler.
All those in favor say aye.
Oh.
Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. Seeing none, that passes. Ooh, I have a gavel. Just kidding, I don't, but yay. Okay, moving on to next. Do we need to approve anything else?
From my perspective, I think that provides us a good pathway.
I think so too. Okay, so meeting next, Nick and I will work together. We'll put this together in paper form. Watch your emails for that to come, and then share any feedback. Our next meeting is November 18th. Is that right? I feel like I'm going off of and we're in person. But I think we're at a new location. Right, it's not in the same room. We're at the Capitol for the 18th. Is that correct?
I will turn that over to Mina if she's ready.
Yes, that is correct. It will be in the Capitol. Let me just double check on the room very quickly.
I have G3 as the location.
Yep, that's correct. G3.
Okay, perfect. So stakeholders will come back and engage. We'll reach out. We'll have their feedback on some of the things that we've talked about in our areas of topic. And then we'll just continue to work on recommendations. You all have Nick's information, I believe. And so if you have any questions or things you want to add, you'll have all the agency contacts. Make sure that if you have any clarifying questions that you need from them or research, you're reaching out to them prior to the meeting as well, because now we will want to move forward with the path starting November, because I don't think we have a couple meetings left. Does anybody else have any business they want to discuss? Seeing none, thanks all for coming. Our meeting is adjourned. Thanks all. Have a good day.